Mr. Murdoch, one of the things Mr. Dolan said to us earlier was that the TSB were going to give them a draft so that they could look at issues of fact. We've just had a prolonged discussion between Senator Xenophon and Mr. Dolan around new and significant, and the facts, as came out in paper very clearly before the Senate committee, was that there was new information, and particularly I refer to the Chambers report. It was significant because the ATSB report said that the regulatory system that was in place didn't need investigation, and yet the new information highlighted that CASA itself knew that there were significant deficiencies in that which had not been highlighted. So the evidence in black and white said it was new and significant. Our concern is that if ATSB are given the role of deciding what is factual and if there are factual errors in the TSB report, if TSB say this is new and significant and it should have been investigated, what we've just heard from Mr. Dolan yet again is that the ATSB considered it completely within their remit to say, well, we are the ones legally charged with deciding if it's new and significant. We decide that's factually incorrect, send it back to the TSB with an amendment. That hardly inspires confidence in the aviation community in Australia.
I didn't read the way you've taken that from what Mr. Dolan has said here today or previously in relation to the nature of the Canadian draft report. I wouldn't lead you to the conclusion that you've reached, I don't think, Senator. Knowing the way in which these processes are undertaken and the integrity of the agency involved, I don't think you could lead to the conclusion you're reaching from the ATSB being asked to fact-check a document. I don't think that's the way the Canadian authorities would ever see that taking place.
Well, can I ask you then, Mr. Murdoch, was the Chambers report new information?
Senator, I wasn't involved in the process at the time. I certainly, from reading the Senate report, I can certainly accept the view that it provided additional and new information. As to whether that was germane to the issue of the circumstances which the ATSB reported on, that's a matter of judgment.
Which comes down to the issue at hand, Mr. Murdoch. But I think the concern of the committee is very clear that given ATSB's response to date to completely deny the black and white facts that were laid before the Senate inquiry, upon threat we had to require the documents to be delivered to us, and they then exposed in black and white this new and significant information. For the agencies to say it's not new and it's not significant, or not a combination of both, just flies in the face of logic.
Well, again, I can only take you to what I anticipate being a very rigorous review by the Canadian peer review. We'll have to stand on and look at that document at that time.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Murdoch, further to Senator Forster's line of questioning, is a review by the TSB, the Canadian TSB, one on the documents, or are they actually seeking to interview people involved in that incident and in the investigation?
I don't know the end. I don't know the full circumstance of what they're reviewing, Senator. I'll take that on notice and come back to you.
Well, does Mr. Dolan know whether is it a review on the documents or is it a review that goes beyond that? In other words, interviewing members of the ATSB and some of the other parties that gave evidence, including to the inquiry, Senate inquiry, including those who are actually involved in the incident itself.
Ms. Tadros was clear that it was not the purpose of this investigation of her independent review to undertake a re-investigation of the Pell Air accident or the other two accidents that were also part of the terms of reference. And so the review has been limited to all the material available, all the relevant material from the ATSB and interviews with ATSB staff.
Well, hold on. So it's basically a review on the documents, is that right?
And those involved in the investigation process and the review mechanisms of the process.
So it would involve actual interviews, person interviews of some of the ATSB staff, correct?
Correct, Senator.
But what about the material that was uncovered in the course of the Senate inquiry? Is that the subject of the TSB's review?
All the material that was published as a result of the Senate inquiry has been made available to the TSB, Senator.
I understand that, but is that also the subject of review by the TSB?
The TSB is looking at the process by which the ATSB undertook this investigation, and that material is relevant to their consideration. I haven't been taken, I wouldn't expect to be taken chapter and verse through the process that the TSB is using to meet their terms of reference. I'm happy, and I'm not sure whether it's been done previously, to supply the terms of reference to
I think we have those.
the committee
Yeah.
to give some context as to what's actually being undertaken by the
I think the
Canadians.
committee has those terms of reference, Mr Dolan. What I'm trying to establish is if it's a review simply on the documents, that may raise concerns as to the adequacy of the review, because sometimes if the documents disclose an area of concern, that might itself lead to, for instance, talking to, interviewing those involved in the actual incident or those that gave evidence to the Senate inquiry about their views as to the adequacy or otherwise of the ATSB's investigation.
At this stage, as I understand it, Senator, TSB hasn't thought it necessary for the scope of their inquiry to undertake those sorts of interviews.
And sorry, just one final before go back to Senator Fawcett. But were you told? Did the TSB tell you why they didn't think it was necessary, or did you make? Did the ATSB make in any way representations to the TSB that interviewing interested parties, including those involved in the incident and those involved in the investigation, and those who proffered an opinion to the Senate inquiry, ought not to be interviewed for the purpose of the TSB report?
No, Senator, we never had any discussion of that nature with the TSB. The discussion I had with Ms Tadros was to lay out the fact that a highly critical report of one of our investigations had been issued by a Senate committee, that it called into question a range of our procedures and how we applied them, and it related to a particular investigation. We thought the benefit of an external and independent peer review of those processes by the TSB, which runs comparable processes and in a similar legal framework to us, would be of benefit. Ms Tadros put forward a proposed terms of reference, which we commented on but didn't really make much in the way of adjustment to, and from then on the process has essentially been a Canadian process.
Sure. So what I'm understanding from that is no stakeholders outside of ATSB have been involved in the review by TSB.
That's my understanding, Senator.
Do you think that's appropriate?
I've left to the TSB the decisions as to how best to meet the terms of reference that were agreed and therefore to undertake the investigation.
But it's the preferred course of the ATSB that the TSB just look at the documents and, if need be, speak to people within the ATSB. That you're more comfortable with that approach?
The preferred course of the ATSB is that the TSB makes its own independent decisions about what it needs to look at and finalise an independent report into the adequacy of our procedures and how we applied them in the case of 3 investigations.
Mr Murdoch, is there a draft of that report available?
I don't believe a draft has been completed at this stage, Senator. I think from Mr Dolan's evidence, he's expecting a draft report
Before Easter.
before Easter.
So insofar as the ATSB quite appropriately will be able to comment on that draft report, will other interested stakeholders have an opportunity to comment on that draft report?
I'm not familiar with the process, Senator. I think Mr Dolan's indicated that the ATSB will make matters of fact comments, but essentially the report is a matter for the Canadian Transport Safety Board.
But Mr Murdoch, and again, and to Mr Dolan, I can understand completely it's entirely appropriate for the ATSB to comment on any draft, but wouldn't it also be appropriate for interested parties, the pilot, some of the witnesses, the pilot, the co-pilot witnesses who gave evidence in relation to their views on that, and indeed the Senate committee itself that spent an enormous amount of time in relation to dealing with the evidence, considering the evidence, that they would be part of that, because presumably if the TSB is going to be making comment on the Senate committee's report and its processes, wouldn't we have an interest as a stakeholder to comment on any draft?
Senator, I can certainly see an interest. I think I'd need to come back to you in terms of the process, as whether that is best done after the TSB has lodged a report. I think
Well,
that...
no, I don't think that's quite... Well, that doesn't seem to address the issue, Mr Murdoch. If the ATSB will have an opportunity to comment on a draft report, which I acknowledge is entirely proper and appropriate, isn't it also entirely proper and appropriate for other interested parties, such as this committee itself, and the other parties directly involved in the Norfolk or the ditching of the Pale Air aircraft, to also have an opportunity to comment on it?
Something I would have to take on notice, Senator, in terms of the next steps once the ATSB has had an opportunity to provide any factual comment as to whether the TSB would then be looking for a further comment. It may be a case, I think the intention of the ATSB was always that the TSB report would be publicly released.
No, that's not answering the... Sorry, I'm sorry, Mr Murdoch. That's not addressing the issue. The issue is one of fairness of process. The issue is one of due process. It's clearly due process for the ATSB to comment on the TSB draft. Entirely appropriate, but don't you think it's also appropriate for other interested stakeholders, particularly given that it seems to me that the trigger for the TSB's inquiry or report into the Palair incident and the ATSB's report was highly critical comments by this committee, references committee that looked into it. I would have thought in terms of procedural fairness that a Senate committee ought to have an opportunity to comment to the TSB if the very basis of the inquiry by the Canadian TSB was the trigger for it was this very committee's report.
Senator, I can see the point you're making. I'll need to take on notice and discuss that with perhaps the Canadian TSB about what their handling approach is.
Could you get back to this committee as a
Certainly.
matter of urgency in respect of that, please?
Mr Dolan, would you just be able to clarify? You said there were 3 investigations have been referred. Clearly the Norfolk Island was one. The other 2?
The other 2 were the Canley Vale crash, an aeromedical flight where a pilot and a nurse died, and the winching accident at Bridal Veil Falls, which was again an aeromedical procedure, and so we were looking at 3 that were in broadly similar territory, and they're the 3 that the TSB, after some suggestions from us, agreed were the appropriate to look at.
Sure. With the Canley Vale accident, were they also given access to CASA documents? Just given what we found in the Norfolk Island incident, where significant issues like CASA's own recognition that their oversight of the company was deficient, which was never reported nor disclosed to ATSB. Do TSB have the option to, or did they have the option and access to CASA personnel and information about the Canley Vale incident?
The question never arose, Senator. Their initial review was based on the material that was available to the TSB and interviews with the investigator in charge and others in the organisation. And I'm assuming, since there's been no request from the Canadians, that they weren't looking further than material that was already available to the ATSB.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Can I ask one final question then, just to get on the record? The fact that CASA had determined that their own regulatory oversight of the company in question was deficient and materially impacted on the safety and things like fuel planning, etc. Can I just take from your comments that you think that was insignificant?
No, Senator. It was significant, but in the assessment of the ATSB, it was not new.
Okay,
We were aware of the territory that was covered, and I gave a formal response to the References Committee in relation to our views on the Chamber's report and its relevance to the Pale Air investigation.
Just confirming, though, in that response you did say that that you weren't aware of the Chamber's report. You're aware they had done a special audit, but you weren't aware of the Chamber's
That's
report?
correct, Senator.
So you've just said it's significant, and you've just confirmed that it is new. To my mind, that very clearly brings about the 2 criteria for reviewing the efficacy of the report.
I don't think, Senator, I said it was significant. I did say it was new.
Could I just